just click unmute right Testing. Sammy, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jay.
Oh, good, Vince. I had no noise, so I was worried my speaker was dead.
We can hear you loud and clear. Good afternoon or good evening, everybody.
Good.
Another trick is under where you see your mute, you have a little arrow pointing up. You go in there, you can test speaker and microphone.
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Bill, I can hear you well.
All right.
No. Well, I want to welcome everybody, and we will be starting very soon. Just one technicality before we start the meeting. If you want to be recognized, since the screen, there are multiple screens, so we can't see everybody at the same time. So if you want to be recognized, if you're using tablets, click on the three dots, and then there is a feature where you can raise your hand. So raise your hand, and then the chair will be calling on you. And then you can lower your hand after you speak. The other way to do it on a laptop, probably you need to click on participants, and then under participants, the feature that says raise your hand is there. And if you want to give it a practice and raise your hand right now, feel free to do that. Just make sure you lower your hand afterwards. By raising the hand, I meant the virtual one, not the real one. So it's three dots and then raise hand, or on the laptop, participants, and then raise hand. Wonderful. This is great. And for whoever will be chairing after the beginning, make sure that you pay attention to the participants list. Probably on some platforms, it will show you someone is raising their hand, but on the participants list, you will see hands raised there. All right, I want to get a thumbs up from Ryan and Jennifer if you feel ready to go. I'm good. Are we good to go?
Sammy, I gave you a thumbs up, but a real thumbs up. We do have a quorum.
Wonderful. We're calling the meeting to order, the Budgets Review Committee for the Corvallis School District on May 14th, 2020 at 6:31 p.m. And the meeting has been called to order. Welcome everyone who is listening to us over the YouTube channel. The meeting is being broadcasted live and also recorded for the audience to review. And I want to welcome our fellow citizen member committee members. Thank you very much for your service. It's very much appreciated. So the first thing on the agenda is the nomination and election of officers. I would like to call for nominations for Budget Review Committee Chair. Is there anyone who would like to nominate an individual in the committee for Budget Committee Chair? Catherine?
I would like to nominate Sarah McDonald, please.
Thank you. Sarah, would you accept the nomination? And at the same time, I would like to give a disclosure that there's nothing really prohibit us from having a school board member being a chair or vice chair of the committee. Traditionally, we have had citizen members chairing and vice chairing the committee. Has been the tradition. So I'll leave it to the committee to decide. Sarah, would you accept the nomination?
Sorry, I missed the moment of the meeting when I was nominated. Of course, that's what happens. You show up a minute late and you get nominated. So what have I been nominated for?
You've been nominated to the Budget Committee Chair. And I just mentioned that's traditionally we had citizen committee members being the chair of the committee. But I'll leave it up to the committee to decide how we want to go with this.
I mean, I kind of like the tradition of having a citizen committee member be chair. If no one wants to be chair, I can certainly do it. But I would like to give the opportunity to a citizen member to take that role if they would like.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. So on that note, is there any further nominations?
Sorry, I can't find my raising the hand thing. Where is that?
So it is on the iPad or devices, it's 3 dots and then raise hand, or under participants and then raise hand. So
There it is. Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, anyway, I'm raising my hand. I would like to nominate Peter to be chair.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a nomination for Sarah, a nomination for Peter. Is there any further nominations, Vince?
Well, I was going to nominate Leanne, but she had just entered the meeting, so it's kind of sudden, just like Sarah. But I'm happy to support. I'll withdraw my nomination.
All right. Peter, do you accept the nomination?
Well, I may need some help and guidance. Do you have any guidance? Otherwise, I think it might run better if you have someone who's done this before.
Right. I'll be happy to help you out with some guidance if you would like to. But yeah, if there's someone else who would like to step up, and it's really up to you. So Peter, Leanne, how do you feel about chairing the committee?
I'm fine. I'll need some guidance too, but I'm fine. That's fine. Sorry to join late, everyone.
Not at all. So for whoever will share under your agenda, there is some script that will be guiding in your packets. There is a script that will guide the chair in conducting the meeting. So hopefully that will help. But if you have any questions about Robert's Rules of Order or how to go forward with it, I'll be happy to help out. So with that in mind, we have Vince, go ahead.
Well, I withdrew my nomination, but I'd like to extend it again. As we're in the run up to this, I thought Leanne has been on budget committee ever since I've been on the school board. So, and she's always had a great presence in the room. And so I would love to see her lead our meeting.
Wonderful. So given all the nominations, any further nominations? All right, hearing no objections or further nominations, the nominations are closed, and I would like to invite a motion to nominate. So let's go with a formal motion. Vince, would you like to go for a motion?
I move to nominate Leanne Baker to chair the Corvallis School District Budget Commission.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Vince and seconded by Teresa, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes.
To nominate Leanne Baker for the chair of the Budgets Review Committee. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those against, say nay. The ayes have it. The affirmative passes and the motion passes. So now I'll be handing the meeting to Leanne. Leanne, on your agenda, you will find a script that will help you walk through the meeting with some suggestions for the language, and the meeting is yours now.
Okay. I am calling for nominations for Budget Review Committee Vice Chair. Vince,
So I'd like to nominate Peter Sabay-Paulson for vice chair.
Peter, do you accept this nomination?
I will accept that. Yes. Thank
Right.
you.
Therese, do you have another nomination?
I was going to nominate Peter, so we're all good.
All right, other nominations? All right. Is that a formal motion? Vince, was that a formal motion?
Would you like me to phrase it as a motion?
Tammy, do I need to phrase it as motion?
Yes.
I do. Sorry, Vince.
I move to nominate Peter Sabay-Paulson as vice chair of the Corvallis School District Budget Commission.
Second.
Thank you, Therese. Hearing no objections or further nominations, the nominations are now closed. All those in favor of Peter as Budget Committee Vice Chair, say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Peter, your Vice Chair. All right. I will now invite Superintendent Noss to present the budget message.
All right. Well, thank you to our board members and our public budget committee members for joining us tonight. I'll go through my budget message. Typically what I do is I read through the message in entirety. So I'll take just a minute or two to share the budget message with the budget committee. Sorry, there's a little feedback. So I'm going to hold off just for a second. Okay, there we go. To your budget committee, colleagues, and Corvallis community, I submit for your consideration the proposed budget for the Corvallis School District for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2020 and ending June 30th, 2021. I'm honored to serve you and the community of Corvallis in my 5th year as the superintendent, and I believe this budget reflects the vision and goals of the district and district resources where needed most to create new possibilities with a focus on equity for our students and community. Many of the decisions we make in developing a budget are impacted by external factors beyond our control. This is true in ordinary times and will be even more true this year. This budget proposal assumes that education funding in Oregon will remain at levels originally adopted by the state legislature for the 2019-2021 biennium, and that the Student Success Act, funded through a new corporate activity tax, will be fully implemented. However, we know that the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will likely reduce projected revenue in the final year of the biennium, and that the state school fund could be disproportionately impacted for the 2021 fiscal year. We also believe that the future state revenue forecast will likely show a significant reduction in corporate activity taxes, which will translate into a significant reduction in funds available to implement the Student Success Act. While there's a lot we do not know yet about the year ahead, what I do know is that our dedicated staff are here for our students and families, working hard and finding solutions for the many challenges we face now and into the future. As we anticipate revenue shortfalls, we are working to develop contingency plans that can be implemented in the event of a substantial loss of funding. Combined with federal stimulus funds and the potential deployment of state and district reserves, these plans will help us respond with flexibility to move quickly as the economic story in Oregon continues to unfold. Regardless of the many challenges we face, we are committed to developing a budget that will best serve the students of our community. The first step in our budget process is to ensure that our financial plan is rooted in the priorities of the district. Every student graduates, every student shows growth, and to close the opportunity gap. Through a continual emphasis on these three priorities, our students are succeeding at levels that continue to outpace the state averages. The district's graduation rate for 18-19 was 89%, an increase of 2% from the previous year and 7% higher than the district's graduation 3 years ago in 2015-16. While we have much reason to celebrate this success, we must continue to focus on how to close the opportunity gap for students navigating poverty, students with disabilities, emerging bilingual students, and students of color. The district's strategic financial plan served as the starting point for the development of this budget proposal, which includes actions to implement the instructional priorities described in the plan. Using a collaborative process, our intent is to establish and nurture a district-wide culture that prioritizes the smart and strategic use of resources in order to improve outcomes for all students. The strategic financial plan will continue to be an important document used in our decision-making process. Here's a summary of the proposed budget. The annual proposed budget is the district's plan for the upcoming school year. At the same time, the annual budget is part of long-term investments in the educational experiences of that our students receive. It's important to think about our budget as a year in time, not just as a year in time, and a 13th of the educational opportunities we provide our students. This budget proposal includes a total investment of $351.9 million, represented by 11 separate funds, the largest of which are the General Fund and Capital Projects Fund. The total budget for all funds is a $2.0 million or 0.6 increase over the 1920 budget. This budget proposal includes ongoing allocations for strategic investments to support the district's strategic financial plan, while recognizing the financial challenges that we face with adequately funding all priorities. General fund budget. The general fund represents 28% of the 2021 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for most operating activities of the district, except those activities required to be accounted for in other funds. General fund revenues come from two main sources: local property taxes and the state school fund, primarily funded through state income tax. The 2021 proposed budget is based on a $9 billion state school fund, with 49% allocated in 1920, the first year of the biennium, and 51% allocated in 2021. Budgeted general fund current resources total $88.3 million, an increase of $8.4 million or 10.5% from 1920. The majority of the increase in general fund resources is due to the new student investment account made available through the Student Success Act. Budgeted general fund current requirements total $89.9 million, an increase of $2.5 million or 2.9% from 1920. Salaries and benefits comprise the majority of expenses at $70.4 million or 78% of all current requirements. School Board Policy DA, Fiscal Policies, provides guidance regarding the financial objectives for managing general fund reserves. Those objectives include establishing a sustainable level of programs, protecting the district from unnecessary borrowing to meet cash flow needs, providing prudent reserves to meet unexpected emergencies, protecting against catastrophic events, and meeting the uncertainties of state and federal funding. As outlined in the policy, all general fund contingency and reserve accounts are budgeted to result in the levels required. Assuming underspending of 1.5%, a small projected operating deficit of 0.3 million will be offset by surplus reserves. Capital Projects Fund budget. The Capital Projects Fund represents 54% of the 2021 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for activities related to the acquisition, construction, and equipping of school facilities. Capital Project Fund revenues come from three main sources: proceeds from the sale of bonds, bond premium, and interest earnings. Corvallis voters approved the issuance of 199.9 million in general obligation bonds on May 15, 2018 to finance capital improvements at all schools. The successful passage of the 2018 bond is helping us make sound investments, solve long-term challenges, and transform an aging infrastructure to offer more innovative and equitable opportunities for all students. Bond proceeds are providing funds to install new safety and security equipment, replace portables with permanent classroom spaces, replace 2 elementary schools, renovate and repair school buildings, and expand educational spaces for career and technical education programs. The 2021 proposed budget for the Capital Project Fund totals 190.9 million and includes funding for several projects that are underway, including the replacement of Lincoln Elementary and Hoover Elementary, and renovations at Garfield Elementary and Sheldon Middle School. Looking forward, the district's long-term projections are designed to provide the fullest picture of the district's financial future so that decisions making today can support high quality and innovative educational programs tomorrow. Economic factors are more uncertain and complex than ever before. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic are only just beginning to be seen, and the long-term effects remain a mystery to us all. These are moving targets and substantial challenges as we are making decisions for future years without currently knowing all the answers. We are charting a new course in our district, and flexibility will be key as we move forward. We're committed to doing everything in our power to help all kids successfully continue their educational journey with us. We know that reserves alone will not be enough to cover anticipated revenue shortfalls, and we recognize that we will have to be creative in shifting the allocation of resources and spending funds directly in order to continue investments in programs that support our priorities. In conclusion, this proposal represents the work of the entire team of building principals and department and program managers who have studied and implemented the process of strategic budgeting and labored as a team to propose a budget based on our district's goals and instructional priorities. We recognize the importance of presenting a quality, easy to understand budget to the community. In recognition of our commitment to communicate the district's goals and objectives clearly and illustrate our commitment to adhering to national recognized budget presentation standards, the district has once again received the Association of School Budget Officials International Meritorious Budget Award. This award reflects our district's dedication to sound fiscal management and budgetary policies. In closing, I want to thank our staff, students, parents, and community for their ongoing support and patience during this challenging time in our district, state, and nation. This year will mark a chapter in our lives that includes a roller coaster of emotions and experiences, but we are in this together, and doing what is best for all students will continue to inform our decision-making as we navigate this new normal. I would also like to express my appreciation to the members of the Budget Committee for their service, support, thoughtful analysis, dialogue, and consideration of this proposed budget. Respectfully submitted, Ryan Na, Superintendent.
Thank you. My agenda says that possibly Olivia will be offering some highlights. Is that so?
Yes, that is so.
Okay, then I pass it to Olivia.
Okay. I have just a few slides.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I pass it to Operation Director Myers-Bush.
Okay. I'm just going to cover a couple of highlights about the budget. This information was included in the superintendent's budget message, but just kind of providing some more visuals and an overview of our resources and requirements. So the total budget for all funds proposed for 2020-21 is just shy of $352 million. Our general fund budget is at $99.8 million. Our general fund operating resources at $87.9 million, and our represents an increase of 10.5% from the prior year. The majority of that is because of the new student investment account funding through the Student Success Act. In terms of the resources we receive, the majority of our funding is received through the state school fund, about 83% of our operating resources. Our local option levy provides about 8% of operating resources, and other sources has increased significantly for the 2021 proposed budget at 9%. And again, about $5 million of that amount is the student investment account. Our general fund operating requirements total $89.9 million. That represents a 2.9% increase from the current year budget. And in looking at how our spending is planned for 2021, the majority of our resources will be spent on salaries and benefits at about 78% of our budget. Purchase services represents about 15% of our budget, and the majority of that is our contracted student transportation, supplies and materials at 5%, and other objects at 2%. So obviously the majority of what we spend our funds on is people and staffing at just shy of, or at $70.4 million. In terms of our general fund reserves, the board policy DA does require 3 separate reserve funds: a operating contingency, an unappropriated ending fund balance, and a rainy day fund. All of those 3 reserves are budgeted at the levels required in board policy. And I'm going to spend some time talking about our board goals, our instructional priorities, and our strategic investments. So I'll be spending quite a bit of time on pages 25 through 28 of the budget document. And if you have that in front of you, you can kind of follow along. And what we'll cover is just an overview of our board goals, our instructional priorities, the alignment between those two, and then talking about the strategic investments we've been making in the current year and what's planned for next year as well. So the board has 5 goals. Ryan talked a little bit about the 3 priorities in his budget message. Every student graduates, every student shows growth and close the opportunity gap. So the 4 board goals that we focus on primarily when it comes to strategic investments is the first 4: student achievement, equitable systems, real world learning, and health and wellness. So around those 4 board goals, we have implemented 6 different instructional priorities. And so those are listed on the bottom of page 25 of the budget document. And these are also what our strategic financial plan revolves around is these 6 instructional priorities. So adopting effective instructional and curriculum programs, developing early childhood education programs, improving equity and opportunities and outcomes through the use of culturally relevant practices, growing and mentoring effective educators, ensuring all students are ready for college or career, and enhancing programs that support student social and emotional learning. And you can see how all of those different instructional priorities align with our board goals. Some of them align with more than one board goal, some of them align with all of our board goals, but you can kind of see how they are intertwined there. And then on pages 26 and 27, we dig a little bit deeper, and within each instructional priority that is tied to those board goals, we talk about specific strategic investments that we've been making. And I want to kind of highlight some of them in certain areas, and then talk a little bit about how we're planning to move forward with our strategic plan, knowing that a lot of the measurements we use to a lot of the metrics that we use to measure the investments are not going to be available to us this year. So when we talk about adopting effective instructional and curriculum programs, the majority of investment in this area is through adopting culturally relevant curriculum. We've been doing that for the last couple of years. We are following the state of Oregon adopted curriculum schedule. We just are wrapping up a social studies adoption that the board approved at the last school board meeting last week. So we'll be implementing that. And right now we do have plans for curriculum adoption next year, but we know that that is something that may be put on hold until we know more about our projected revenues. We also have a lot of investments in this area that tie back to our high school success grant or Measure 98. And so we've made some changes at our high schools to expand our schedule from 7 to 8 periods and having a required freshman success class combined with a health class for 9th graders, and done some expansion of programming at College Hill. And so you can see that the change in investment between the current year and next year is a slight decrease. That primarily reflects less sections of the health class for freshmen next year and some alternative education programming at the middle school. We're adding some staffing at the middle school that will help lower class sizes in core subjects. And so there won't be as many students enrolled in some of the alternative programming at the middle school level. When we talk about developing early childhood education programs, it represents a pretty small percentage of our strategic investments. And it's also an area that's been slow to grow and will likely not grow much in the next couple of years based on what's kind of going on at the state level. The changes from last year to, or from this year to next year, really just reflect more of the reality of what we're actually doing and aligns with programming. Our kindergarten academy has been successful in the past, and we still have plans for that. Talking about increasing our partnerships and collaboration, we'll probably see more of that, especially with limited daycare facilities at this point in time. And then just doing what we can to provide extra support to kindergarten classrooms at the beginning of the year. We usually allocate some additional staffing the first few weeks of the year in those classrooms. So again, pretty minimal change from this year to next year. We see a bigger increase in the instructional priority around increasing equity in opportunities and outcomes, primarily because of an expansion of the dual language immersion program at Corvallis High School. So as we see more students progressing through the grade level, Corvallis High School continues to serve more dual language immersion students. And so this allows them to add more sections of the DLI programming into their master schedule. We're also planning to increase the budget for professional development focused on race and culturally relevant instruction. This is primarily related to programming we've established with students and families. So we have a group called SAFE, which stands for Students Advocating for Equity. And we're seeing an uptick in activity around that program. And then our Delta Advisory Group, so that is our District Equity Leadership Team Advisory. It's a group of parents and students and families, community members who advise our District Equity Leadership Team in lots of areas. Last week at the school board meeting, there was even part of the presentation on the curriculum adoption talked about how our Delta group influenced some of the decision making around that as well. In the category for growing and mentoring effective educators, I will point out that when I was looking at this, it kind of looked funny to me at the top of page 27, the first line, when it talks about expanding recruitment strategies. The prior year investment is correct at $65,000, but the new investment should say $5,000 and the total investment is $70,000. So I think I was getting a little rummy at the time that I was putting this together. So to be clear, the first line for growing and mentoring effective educators, the prior year investment, $65,000. the new investment 5,000, and the total investment is 70,000. The total is correct, and the grand total is correct, but I just want to let you know that that's a mistake. And so we're seeing a fairly small increase in this area, and it's primarily related to roll-up costs with our mentoring program. We also have building buddies that receive extra duty stipends, and they're paired with new teachers. And so we're rolling that up into this as well. And the small change in the recruitment strategies is to reflect some of the new things we've been doing around recruiting staff of color, which is really getting specific about the types of job fairs and recruitment activities that we participate in, and seeing some change in that area as well. In the priority around ensuring all students are ready for college and career, it does show a reduction in this area. And the reason for that is around CTE programming. We've rolled up all of the staffing that is planned in that area into next year. But in terms of non-staffing costs for things like supplies and equipment, and none of that's been finalized for next year yet. And so it looks like a decrease, but the reality is we'll probably end up increasing the investment for next year. We just didn't have that information when the budget was developed. So there is a slight decrease in that area around the sustainability and increasing our partnerships and coordination there. That shows a $20,000 decrease, and that's primarily due to some consulting work that we've had done this year, and that will transition away from that next year now that we've had our new sustainability coordinator on for a year. And then with regard to programs that enhance student social and emotional learning, that's probably the area of biggest change for us. And that's really reflecting our current levels of mental health staffing. So we added 4 mental health therapists to our staff this year and 4 mental health skills trainers. And so this accounts into rolling up those positions into next year. And for professional development focused on social and emotional learning strategies, there's an increase in there that reflects expanding our training around collaborative problem solving for staff and doing some more targeted work in that area. So that's kind of a summary of the alignment with our board goals. And Ryan covered some big highlights in the superintendent's budget message about the overall budget, the general fund budget, and the capital projects fund budgets. Those are our 2 biggest funds in terms of the budget. And so that's just a really quick and dirty overview of the proposed budget. And I wanted to make sure we had enough time after public comment for questions and answers that the budget committee may have.
Okay, so before we go into public comment and before we get into a lot of discussion on this, are there any clarifying questions of Ryan or Olivia? I'm looking at the raising of the hands on the side. Okay. Last call. All right. We'll now move into public comment.
Actually, you have Bill that raised his hand.
Oh, sorry. I missed it. Bill, go ahead. The floor is yours.
That was a mistake.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
But I didn't miss anything. All right. At this time, the committee would like to hear comments from the public. Due to the time constraints, public comment at this meeting will be limited to a maximum of 45 minutes. Public comment will also be heard at our next meeting scheduled for May 28th. Do we have anyone that is here to comment from the public? Public comment.
Hi, Leanne. This is Jen Schroeder.
Hi.
Your committee secretary. And I will tell you that the only two individuals who chose to comment this evening were Denise Cardinelli and Scott Newsham, who opted to provide written testimony that was emailed to the group of you earlier today. It's also been posted on Board Book, so the folks watching at home can navigate there and pull that information up should they choose. So those are your only two public testimonies. So I saved you from reading that whole script, Leanne.
Thank you so much. That's exciting. Okay, I guess we will review those because I have not reviewed them, but I will review those shortly after our meeting. We will then move on. Before we begin committee discussion, does any committee member wish to make any disclosure for the record? Okay. We will open the meeting for committee deliberation questions and requests for more information. You can signal to me under your participants tab. Under your participants tab, you can raise your hand. Ah, Bill.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear Olivia's discussion of the relationship between the state sources of funds that's in the budget and the real life situation that's going on at the state of Oregon and the May 20th budget estimate.
Okay, so I can certainly speak to that. As Ryan noted in his superintendent's budget message, this proposed budget doesn't assume any change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we do assume and expect that statewide revenues will decrease. We know that in Oregon, personal income tax is the primary driver for our state general fund, and when unemployment is high like it is right now, we know that has a significant impact on the state budget. What I would say right now is that what we're working with are some pretty high level assumptions around what we are expecting. We know that there will likely be a reduction not only in the state school fund allocation, but also in the student investment account. Student investment account is tied to a new corporate activity tax that just went into effect on January 1. We assume that due to lower economic activity, that the revenue originally projected for that tax will likely be less. And so in terms of what we expect to see on May 20th, we just expect that the assumptions around revenue projections changing will happen, that the projections will indicate less funds available. The revenue forecast won't necessarily give us any indication of what the change in the state school fund allocation may be, or any sort of legislative action that may be taken as a result of that. We assume that after the May forecast comes out, that the legislature will convene for a special session, but that is not a given. And at this point in time, outside of some across the board cuts that have already been initiated by the governor, only the legislature can modify the state school fund allocation or deploy state level reserves to offset a shortfall, revenue shortfall. So really what we're anticipating more than the May forecast at this point is the result of legislative session. We anticipate that the legislative session could start maybe as early as mid-June, early June maybe. And we anticipate that we probably won't know a lot of specifics around what our actual shortfall will be probably until mid-July. And so as a result of that, obviously that goes into our new fiscal year. We know that if once we have that information, we'll have to act pretty quickly and implement some changes quickly. And so we've been spending some time already, and we'll be spending a lot more time in the next month or so working on plans and identifying areas of the budget, identifying areas for reduction. The superintendent's indicated pretty strongly his 2 priorities around any sort of general fund reduction. And those priorities are to maintain school days for kids and to maintain a strong workforce. So we want to keep as many people employed as we can, and we don't want to have to reduce instructional time for students. Because we spend the majority of our funds on salaries and benefits and staffing and people, we know it's probably unlikely that we'll be able to achieve balance without reducing salary and benefit costs. And so that has to be a consideration in our planning work, but we're focusing primarily on non-staffing expenses at this time and looking at how we can reduce costs across the board from departments, trying to stay away from classrooms as much as possible, and kind of seeing what results from that before we start talking about eliminating staff. So that's kind of the start of the work that we've been doing. But in terms of at the state level, we know that there's a lot of advocacy around public education. This is nothing new. Every time the legislature is in session every other year, we're usually doing the same thing and advocating for funding, adequate funding for public education. And so this will probably have a similar feel to that. But the timeline is significantly different than what we usually experience. So I know a lot of districts have already sort of talked about, what the possibilities may be. And for us at this point, it's a pretty big range. We expect that our reduction will be anywhere between $5 and $9 million. That's a huge range, and it could land anywhere within that. We don't think it would be worse than that, but we don't realistically think that it would be less than a $5 million reduction. And that's about 5% of our general fund operating budget.
And then that's consistent with the number that I've seen of about 650 million statewide for education funding.
Right. So when the governor started initiating across the board reductions at the state level, that's an 8.5% reduction. The state school fund, the general fund portion of the state school fund, 8.5% reduction results in a $654 million reduction.
So basically all those changes are going to come after this budget. Our work with this budget is completed on the 28th of May.
That's probably true, yes.
Okay.
All right, Sarah and then Josh. Oh, maybe Josh.
Oh, there I am. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to share to add to Bill's question and what Olivia just said, that I was in a meeting for the Oregon School Boards Association Legislative Policy Committee this weekend. And there was a lot of discussion about budgets and the upcoming possible special session of the legislature and what that could mean for school funding. There was a very strong feeling that we fought very hard to get funding for schools, and that the funding we got didn't make us flush. It sort of filled in holes that had been, getting deeper and deeper over years. And so there was a strong feeling that school districts should not be adopting budgets, making big cuts already to our budget, because we need to be able to go to the legislature and say, look, this is what we were expecting. We are not spending money on luxuries. We're spending money on necessities. And so that we can argue in the legislative session that, when they're deciding where to cut and where those deepest cuts should come, school budgets don't look like an easy place to cut, because we're not flush with cash, even though we got the Student Success Act last year, even if we were in our sort of previous world. And if we start cutting now, then it's very easy for the legislature to say, look, it's not a big deal to cut their budgets because they've already taken care of it for us. So we need, it's sort of this political piece where we need to be able to show why school districts need funding so that the decisions to cut us are not just, a simple thing for the legislature. So I just thought I should share that discussion that was had this weekend.
Thank you. Josh.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to the staff for the great presentations and for the awesome binder. I really like it. I had a question about a thing that's been on all of our minds, I guess, recently, COVID-19. I didn't see anything specifically in the budget for things like staff training, social distancing measures, sanitizing, those sorts of things. Do you anticipate there to be significant costs associated with that over the next school year, or are those built into the budget right now? And just kind of generic question about that.
Sorry, I was coordinating response with Ryan there. I'll kind of start a little bit high level with that and let Ryan get into some more specifics. What I would say is even right now, what we're experiencing, there are areas of our budget where we are saving dollars right now. Student transportation, we're seeing some savings there, and substitute costs. Both of those are pretty significant expenses for us. And so we know that there are parts of our budget like that where we are saving some dollars. But the flip side of that is there's areas of our budget, specifically in the technology department and our facilities and maintenance department, where we've seen more spending this year. Technology is related obviously to a lot that has to do with the Distance Learning for All initiative, establishing Wi-Fi zones and providing access for students that didn't have access at home, things like that. Our facilities and maintenance department budget has seen an increase in spending, and that is primarily around costs associated with cleaning, sanitizing, PPE, a lot of the protective measures that have been put in place, and with the kind of work that our school custodians have been doing in the last couple of months. And so we're definitely seeing some change around that right now. And I'll let Ryan kind of speak to sort of like what's on the horizon for that, and what we kind of are talking about right now, although I will say it changes every day.
So with that run up, I think for us right now, some of the things that we do know, we know that tomorrow we'll get guidance around summer school and what it would look like if you were to hold summer school programming, with some really tight guidance and guidelines from the Oregon Health Authority. ODE and the Oregon Health Authority are working over the next 4 weeks to develop a back to school plan for the fall. And again, I expect that there'll be some really tight parameters put into place about that start. What I would say with confidence is that the beginning of the school year will not look like the beginning of any other school year that we've had. And so we have to continue to be responsive. At the same time, the specifics of what that's going to look like are still being developed and drawn up. And so we're paying a lot of attention to it. We're developing some contingency plans, but until we know exactly what that's going to look like in about 4 weeks, then we have to just be in the stage of developing contingency plans. And so that's where we're at right now. In terms of the unknown around the budget, the unknown of the start of the school year is pretty similar, other than we're thinking about what are some of those parameters if we had to reduce budget by percentages. The same thing we're thinking about as we think about the beginning of school year, and what are 3 or 4 scenarios that we need to be planning towards. One is maintaining what we're doing around distance learning. One is that we all go back to school just traditionally, which I think is unlikely, but we still need to plan that way. What does a hybrid model look like, where some kids are coming because of social distancing measures, but not all students are coming every day? Those are the kinds of conversations that we're having right now in preparation for the fall.
Thank you.
Margaret.
All right, so just to chime in a little bit on the end of that comment, I'm just mentioning that the letter that Denise Cardinelli sent as her public testimony commented on the timely need for more school nurses and for better software that can keep student medical records both accessible and confidential. So that's definitely worth reading with respect to how to plan for COVID-related schooling. But then my actual question was on the district website, it talks about the role of the budget committee. And I know this is such a strange year with all these unknowns, but it says the committee on the website, it says the committee tests the budget to see if it meets priorities set by the board. And then this group discusses and revises the proposed budget as needed to meet goals and priorities set by the board. And then it lists a couple questions. It says, are assumptions made realistic? Do expenditures proposed support district goals and priorities within available resources? And this is sort of a problem because, I mean, clearly to me, it looks like the answer is going to be no. The assumptions are not realistic in that you're purposely making a budget that is not taking into account cuts that will certainly be needed. And we're not working within the available resources at this point. So I'm just wondering, what do you see the role of the budget committee being for this particular year? I think it might be a little bit different than how it's defined here, and particularly for the citizen members who will not have, future input like the school board will. What do you see as our role?
I would go back to the initial statements that you read that came from the district website. I think the budget committee's role is to review the proposed budget as it's been presented, to examine that, to look at alignment with our board goals, to think about how our spending plan aligns with those board goals. I think all of that is still very relevant to the conversation. The assumptions in the budget, I would stand by today, because what we are building the budget on is the best information we have right now. And we don't have enough information to change our budget assumptions at this time. And unfortunately, we're probably not going to have that kind of information until after June 30th. And Oregon budget law requires a budget to be adopted by June 30th of each year. And so it is definitely an odd year. And we're not alone. And all 197 school districts across the state are probably, their budget committees are probably thinking the same thing and asking those same questions. But the reality is that the budget was built on the best information we have at this time. Even though we anticipate that things will change, we don't think it's prudent to necessarily modify the budget assumptions and then make a bunch of changes to the budget when we know that it's going to need to be changed again anyway. And I would also kind of go back to what Sarah Finger McDonald had said, and that this budget is based on full funding because that is what we believe we deserve. And so we don't want to put together a budget plan that reflects anything other than that. And I think it's best to be really clear about what our priorities are and what we intend to spend our funds on. And I think it also helps to, when we move forward in budget reductions if we have to go down that road. Having clear priorities in our budget definitely helps the process of reduction, because it makes it easier for us to know sort of what are the untouchables and what are the areas that we're not going to impact as much as maybe some of the other areas. So I think the budget document in the proposed budget still serves as a useful tool as we move along. But I also think that with the timing of everything, it's just unfortunate. And I do think the process doesn't have the same feel as it does in a typical year.
Okay.
I'd just like to add a couple of points for Margaret. The first is that this building it off the 9 billion is what has been provided as guidance across our different professional organizations for this year. So right now I'm meeting with the Department of Education and superintendents across the state once or twice a week. And that's been the guidance that we continue to receive is build on the 9 billion mark. One of the other aspects to that is that when we go into a legislative session, potentially late in June or July, to be able to say this is how we built our budget, and if this is if these are the cuts, then this is how it impacts us in terms of days and FTE and some of those pieces, rather than we've already done everything we can to cut, and now it's still now there's still a dramatic cut. We need to start from what we had anticipated going into this budget session, and then be able to have conversations from there.
Okay, Sammy, then Therese, then Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I think actually Olivia and Ryan mentioned most of what I was thinking of mentioning. It's really, this is a situation where we have some things that are under our control and many things not under our control, maybe under our influence. And the most thing that I can think of as streamlining the thinking process around how I'm treating this budget is we've been given by the legislator a promise, or they passed a budget and they said, this is how much you should expect in terms of revenue. And from that expectation or assumption that we have, which we know will not be the reality in a few months, we're building the requirements. And the budget committee's role is really essential here to really check for that alignment from the requirement side. And if we have that alignment from the requirement side, again, yeah, just like Ryan, Olivia mentioned, and Sarah, is gives us really good solid argument for Kate Brown, the governor, if she's going to go with over the board deduction, which is her authority, just over the board all the way. We have a good solid ground to say this is what the deduction will mean. It's a deduction from our budget based on the requirements that we believe that we need. And if it goes to the legislator, which is more likely, where they might fine tune where the cuts will go, so healthcare or other entities will have more cuts than the others, then we have really clear statements that here's our requirements and here's our alignment with the requirements. And if Ryan, you could correct me, even OSBA is one of the professional associations that is also consistent with the recommendation that we should pass the budget as required, not as speculated or anticipated. And I think it just makes sense because we don't know how much the legislator will be willing to cut on education.
I can confirm that on Saturday, OSBA was saying expect, budget with, the information we had from the last budget that was passed by the legislature. Mm-hmm. So that's, as of Saturday, that was what OSBA was telling us.
Wonderful, thank you.
I can just speak as an employee of OSBA. That is the advice that we've been giving out over the last couple of weeks.
Therese.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a couple of, I guess, questions integrated with the general idea that I want to convey, but I want to make sure that the idea that I want to convey doesn't already exist in some other form or policy somewhere. So what I'm hearing from Margaret, and what I would agree with, is that we are all around us as discourse saying our economy is not doing well and our budgets are not going as you imagine that they were, 6 months ago. That's not going to be what really happens. And so, school district, what are you doing to prepare? What as a community, what should we expect or anticipate you're going to do to serve our kids in our community when the worst case scenario happens? And so those are going to be questions that people are going to be having in the back of their minds, or maybe even more vocally than in the back of their minds for us. And so, and then here we are now, we're going to enter into what is supposed to be a public process, and something that we have really we've had to strive to bridge some communication deficits with our community so that our budget process is both transparent and the community feels like they can weigh in. And then tonight, we're going to kick off a budget conversation around a budget that we all feel is probably not going to actually come to pass. And yet, we need to make Salem do their job. We shouldn't help them along by saying, well, we're going to voluntarily surrender our need for these dollars. We want to make them do the work because it's their job to solve our budget problem. It's not our community's responsibility to figure out how the state is going to remedy an ongoing budget issue. So I really agree with the sentiment that we need to take the budget of the money that the state told us we would have to work with and go back to them and tell them all the really amazing things we can do in our community with that budget, so that when they're making those decisions, they have those really amazing things in front of them and they understand not just a number, but an actual service, an actual point of impact for our community and for our kids that we would be giving up if they take that money back, if they reallocate that someplace else, or if they ask the schools to be a place where a large or any portion of that budget budget adjustments take place. So I like the idea that we pass a budget that says this is what we need and this is what we built, we visioned, we talked to our community, we made plans, and we've done this in a public process based on what you told us. Now go do what you told us, right? We know that they're probably not going to be able to do that, but we want to send that message. Here's the other side of that coin. If we rubber stamp a budget that we're pretty sure can't happen, won't actually come to pass during the time that is supposed to be our public process, then are we cutting off the community from active engagement around what to do when our budget can't be what we envision or what we hope for it to be, that we talk about all of this great alignment with our goals, our board goals. And at some point, alignment with our board goals is going to boil down to keeping the doors open as a minimum expectation from the board. As a goal, our kids have a place to go to school. And there's room within that, right? From like the very basic, this is the minimum that we have to do to be able to satisfy any of our board goals. We have to have schools. We need to have people to teach in them, up to we'd like to have mental health counselors and more school nurses and librarians and such. At some point in between those two places is where we're going to end up actually landing. Okay, all of that, that's all the working, the tension going on in my head between what I believe we should do to hold Salem accountable and to make a point that our K-12 schools is not where we solve long-term problems. Taking money away from them will make long-term problems worse. And this transparency piece of making sure our community understands that we're not insane and that we fully get that this is probably not going to happen the way we're going to pass it tonight or to next week or the week after. And so we need to make sure that we're also messaging to them that we get that and that we have a plan that is going to not be reactionary, that is going to be thoughtful, and that the public process of including citizen board members and public conversation isn't going to just go away because we can't make this decision around real numbers before we need to turn in a budget. So I've got some conflict inside right now around how we strike that balance of making sure that our community voice isn't lost because we're going to time out before we have hard numbers to really be able to capture them. And so what kind of commitment can we make as a board to ensure that public voice isn't lost while we also comply with the the constraints that we aren't in control of, and the legal processes that we need to satisfy, such as turning in a budget on time. There are questions buried in all of those thoughts, but I just want to now hear from other people who are wiser and probably more concise than I am in terms of interacting with what I just shared.
Yeah, Ryan, please.
I think there's two things that Teresa's comments made me think about. The first one is the my superintendent goals related to this. Again, I mentioned it, or Olivia mentioned it on my behalf, but really for me, the two goals as we move through this time is maintaining school days and maintaining a strong workforce. So I know that there are going to be there's going to be some tension there related to budget and my ability to do those two things. At the same time, those are the two areas that I feel like I want to maintain focus on. So that would be something that I would always appreciate feedback on, but that has up to this point been what my goals have been moving forward through this pandemic. And second to that, one of the things that Margaret asked early on was her role as a citizen budget committee member. And I also know that there will be the need for advocacy as we move through this session and we move through July till we get to a point where we know actually the funding that our schools are going to have. And so in some ways, I think the role may have an additional development this year in that we need support and advocacy to fund our public schools in a way that we thought was sort of behind us and is now right in our face. So I see there's a need in that arena as well.
So I appreciate you bringing us back to the goal of preserving school days and preserving staff. And I do think that comes across clearly. I guess the tension that I then come back to is, that's fantastic. Is the role of this board then, as the role of this budget committee, going to be to agree with or give a nod to say, yeah, Ryan, we agree with you that should be the priority when we get a real number and this conversation is over in this format? What if the committee or what if the general community doesn't necessarily feel like that's what our priority should be? Will they have an opportunity? Where will be the space for them to say, well, wait, hold on. We don't want to preserve school days more than we want to preserve, all of the programming. We would rather have 5 less days of school and keep this programming because this committee will be done. And so that space, that this is a weird space for us to be in. And I guess just my one concern I have is that if the only conversation that we have is limited to a budget on paper that we know won't actually come to pass, I guess what I'm saying is I think we need to create room for conversation around what to message to you in terms of district leadership and message back to the community about the guidance we are providing around what to do when that happens. I don't want us to cut people and I don't want us to cut school days. And that's me. And I'm one person in a community of 55,000 people, and the other 54,000 might not agree. That makes me represent 1,000 people. So forgive the bad math. I'm not Olivia. So, but whatever number is left over besides me, what if they don't necessarily agree that should be the priority? And will they have a space to weigh in and say, no, wait, because a process will be done. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's one of the challenges of being an elected, that in some ways you represent the voice of the community in these decisions. People have a number of avenues to contact you and to share their perspective as well. But yeah, you are representative. When you did the math for those people, yeah, you are representing a number of community members. The other thing I would say is that we, as we developed this budget, we also developed it based on the board goals, which is another process that looked at community input by holding sessions to talk about those board goal areas. We looked at the vision 2020 for the city, and we aligned where our board goals aligned with the city vision, where there were tens of thousands of people that provided input to that. So we've looked at ways where community input helps to leverage and support the work that's happening. That's why those board goals were held in, not abeyance, but they were, kind of held onto before they were acted upon because of the opportunity for more community input. So I think I hear the questions you're asking me, and they're great questions. And I'm just trying to point out or highlight areas where those things are currently happening and have happened as we've worked to develop the budget. And so it doesn't, so while I know the number may not be where we land, the points of community input have helped us to develop it.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that those points of community input don't go away if the number changes. And so it will be the task of district leadership to figure out a new way to capture those points of community input within whatever is whatever the new parameters end up being. Is that a fair way to summarize what you're saying there? Okay. And thank you for saying that they're good questions. I don't know that they necessarily are good questions, but they are not very well formed, I don't feel like, right at this moment. But I do feel like I hear from you that our place is to do the very best that we can to preserve what we have understood to be the perspective of the community, regardless of what our final number ends up being. And I feel comfortable that we can message that out. And it's unfortunate that this is happening. This scenario is happening in May and not in February, when we would have time to go back and get new information, but we don't. I have a lot of confidence in this board being able to do that, especially if we commit that we're going to keep that at the forefront of our thinking as we go through this process. And so, but I appreciate you articulating your position on how you would approach the potential of those questions, and what will likely end up having to be something that comes to pass in terms of making changes. So thank you for letting me kind of go down that road. And I feel pretty comfortable that we can do a job that will be right by our community to the best of our ability, as much as we ever could.
Okay, I have a couple of school board members that have raised their hand recently, and so I'm wondering if maybe their comment is related. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the struggle that, Margaret and Therese and all of us are having right now is probably pretty similar as we've read through this budget, with COVID-19 looming outside our windows. And when I was reading the budget, one thing I kept falling back on was budgets are a statement of our values. And so it made me feel more comfortable about making decisions about budgeting now, because it's a statement to our community about this is what our values are as we form a budget. Our bare minimum values are the ones that Ryan just brought up. If we want to keep our school days and keep our staffs employed, so that the school, we want to keep the doors of our schools open. But this budget has been built around the values and the goals that the school board has established, and those don't go away if our budgets get cut and we have to make adjustments. And so that is sort of what has sort of made me more comfortable with working with this budget now. So thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Peter. Maybe not.
How's that? I have trouble with my mute.
Very good.
Sorry about that. I guess my questions at this point are along the same lines, and I think everything I've heard is definitely something that I worry about. But I think you should be happy. I hadn't heard before. I didn't know that the goal was to send a message, and that sounds like a great approach to me. I think you have, or you're at least certainly in the process of getting that message out very well. I hear it, and I understand the logic of it, and I certainly support it. There's and I think this conversation is how you get the message out. And but just by going through this process, and the process can be painful, but I think with the pain, you do communicate a lot and you build the confidence of the public, and it's worthwhile to do that. And it makes me wonder that at what point, if we were to put together this budget that we know in all probability isn't fundable, just simply because of things that are completely out of our control and perhaps hopefully a once in a lifetime event. So it should be kept in that context that we need to have the freedom to act a little bit outside of the normal bounds of maybe our duties. But at what point do you, if you have this budget and it turns out you have to cut X% because they just simply couldn't find the money, the police need the money, everybody needs their budget, and this is just so extreme, there just simply isn't going to be enough money to go around. I think that's a fact. And there are many other high needs, healthcare needs. It just goes on and on. Equally important needs for our community that we're all under the stress to provide for and probably can't. But at what point, if you get this budget, you take it to the legislature, we do the best we can, you get some of it back. At what point do you have to go back to the budget committee? I think I remember in the past, there was some number where you had to reconvene.
Changes that are made after the budget is adopted are outlined in the local budget law. And there are lots of ways the budget can be amended, and they all are done through school board action. So, and sometimes we transfer appropriations from one category to another. The board may be asked to adopt a supplemental budget. There are some requirements around adopting a supplemental budget, and in that if you are changing any fund by more than 10%, you are required to have a public hearing before the supplemental budget can be adopted. And so the way that Oregon local budget law is written is that the budget committee's role, the expanded budget committee of 14, it ends after the budget is approved and then forwarded to the school board for adoption.
So if I understand that correctly, the burden becomes the board's at that point.
Correct.
All right. All right. So you're asking, I can see how the board can quickly get comfortable with that. That's fair. I guess another question is, I'm just trying to get comfortable with my duty as a citizen to just say, I understand this budget isn't sustainable or is based on assumptions that probably aren't very realistic. And I want to stay true to my duty. Is where does the sustainability language that is referenced in these documents and on the board page come? Is there a legal basis for what we are supposed to do?
So in terms of a balanced budget, current or total resources have to equal total requirements. And so, from a perspective, like when you look at like the general fund, let's say our total general fund resources budgeted have to match our total general fund requirements budgeted. In terms of sustainability, like not spending more than what we bring in or vice versa, the way the budget is proposed, and it's briefly mentioned in the superintendent's budget message. I believe that the proposed budget, the way it is outlined for projected spending, is that it's about $300,000 more in spending than in current resources, which we do have some extra reserves to offset that. And that's a pretty small number, obviously, when you consider the total budget. And so from a sustainability perspective, this is a balanced budget. And of course, lots of things can change. And it's not just on the resources side. We've been talking a lot about revenues and how those may change. But keep in mind, there's a lot of assumptions in the budget as well around spending, particularly in the largest area of spending for salaries and benefits. We are in the middle of negotiations with all of our employee associations. And so the majority of spending in the budget is also built on assumptions that we probably won't know the results of that until much later as well. So it plays into both sides of the coin, because in this particular year, we have unknowns on both sides, revenues and expenditures. And they're the biggest drivers. The biggest driver of our revenue at the state level and the biggest driver of our spending in terms of personnel. So even when we talk about like our budget reduction plans and the type of work we're doing, it's hard to even do some of that work when you don't know what the salary schedule is going to be for next year. And there are likely, and sometimes you end up having to do more reductions as a result of where you end up settling in terms of bargaining. So there's a lot of moving parts. And I would say that from this proposed budget, there are a lot of assumptions built into both sides, not just one.
I understand that. And I mean, certainly the elephant in the room is that the big assumption it revolves around $5 million of shortfall in the revenue, which is stated by the governor at this point, so it can't be ignored as something that's I don't think we can pretend that doesn't exist as an assumption. So the circumstances have caught up with the budget document, at least from the standpoint of somebody who is supposed to look at it in the context of, is it balanced? Maybe another way, do you know, are there legal duties of the committee, the citizen portion of the committee?
According to Oregon budget law, the budget committee approves the budget and approves the tax rate and levy amount. And when that action is made, so we present a proposed budget, the budget committee approves the budget, and then the budget goes to the school board for adoption. The school board adopts the budget, they adopt the tax rate and the levy amount, and then the school board makes the legal appropriations that create the limitations on our spending. And anything that happens after the board adopts the budget requires, any changes to the budget require board action.
Do you, well, it's tricky, and I understand the purpose, and it sounds pretty open. Is there any benefit to making some sort of commitment to the citizen board to come back, to bring them back into the process, if you think that is valuable for the community as a whole?
I think that would be up to the school board to make those kinds of decisions, because the school board is the only governing body that has the legal authority to make those changes.
Another, I guess, kind of tied to that, the assumption, I guess the assumption is that ignoring the funding for a minute, it's as we move forward and if the situation does occur that cuts are necessary, and those cuts seem like they're substantial, and you're exploring contingencies now. How can you talk about the contingencies with any specificity regarding amounts, perhaps the relative amount? You know, what would you do with a $5 million shortfall? What would you do with a $7 million shortfall relative to number of days, number of teachers? What does that look like? Or are you, is this getting too detailed, I guess, but or can you, are you speaking with the with staff and employees and looking for ways to maintain employment and take short-term reductions in salary for the broader good of the community? I understand this is getting a little bit tricky, but you know, it's kind of a big issue now, and this is going to be a big challenge. Everybody really needs to pull together and come together on this, and our community, it's sort of like our the business I run. The federal government has come through and told us, essentially gave us money to keep people on that we would have laid off for the sole purpose of maintaining the economic viability of everybody. It kind of goes along the same lines of looking for unique, perhaps atypical solutions also. So it's kind of, where are you going with your scenarios? What are you protecting? At what point do your protections start to fall away? How, what are you, can you give us any guidance as to how a budget cut looks relative to your priorities when it happens, if it happens?
Sure. So while we don't know what the actual reduction will be, we do know, certain numbers, right? We know that one furlough day for all staff would save $230,000. We know that the average cost per FTE in the proposed budget is $90,000. You can do the math and, crunch some numbers and come up with lots of different scenarios. But like Ryan had said, with his two priorities being around protecting instructional days and a strong workforce, those numbers are kind of, those aren't what we really want to focus on right now, nor do we want to put information out there about, significant layoffs, because we don't know for sure what that will be like. And that causes a lot of anxiety when we put information out about what could be, especially when it involves, people's jobs. So I think we're pretty cautious around those areas when we talk about days and staffing. We're currently bargaining with both of our associations, and those are conversations we are actively having with both associations around how we can keep as many people employed. And when we talk about days, because it's not just school days, it's also, staff work days. And obviously if we change staff work days, that changes their salary as well. So those are all conversations we're having. And I think Ryan has some stuff to add to that as well.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add. One is that we have started to go through and look at our spending patterns with comparison to similar size districts, our partner districts, to look, are there areas that we are spending more than others? Are those areas that we could look at in terms of reduction? So that's one thing we're looking at. With our administrative group, we've already taken a pay freeze for next year. So that's a decision that our principals have made and district office directors have made, I've made. So those are decisions we're making currently, and we'll be taking action on next week at the board level. And so, yeah, so there are a number of things we're looking at right now. We looked at positions that we had posted and which positions could we pull back and not fill. So we've already gone through that exercise with our principals, looking at positions for next, that would start next school year. So there's a number of things that we've been looking at and taking into account, because again, if the goals are going to be to maintain school days and a strong workforce, we have to think of first start with the things and then move to those other pieces of the equation that we want to do less. So those are the kinds of conversations that are happening right now. Then they're primarily happening with our administrative team. There's conversations that have happened with both association presidents, and those are conversations that will be ongoing. The other thing I'd say, sort of to the quandary, is what percentage would we consider now, in terms of if we were going to adopt a budget of less than 9 billion, what would that number be? And to me, that I don't feel like there's any like validity in any of those numbers either, because there's so many pieces that are still yet to take place. Will the legislature come into session? What percentage of the reserves will they allocate to school districts? Will they adjust the governor's 8.5 across the board? They have the ability to do that based on area. So again, I understand the trepidation about accepting a budget with some assumptions, but at the same time, there's assumptions on the other end that are just as hard, if not more difficult, for us to predict.
Thank you. I think I should yield the floor. Thank you for those answers. I'm not really advocating a lesser budget. I'm just looking for a path forward.
Thanks, Peter. Jay, you're up. Thanks everybody for hanging in, those with hands up. Jay.
So thank you. A couple of quick comments and then a bigger thought. I would like the board to consider what Peter has raised and others have thoughtfully raised, that we would commit to, if we have to adopt a supplemental budget, we would commit to a process of communication with the budget board meeting, budget board members, and community before we make finalized cuts. Because I think this is an artificial kind of thing in one respect, but I absolutely agree with Ryan and Olivia that for us to start slicing and dicing right now is the wrong approach. So I'd like us to be ready to maybe talk about that next meeting, whether the board as a group can commit to time down the road once we have a firm dollar figure. I just want to make a comment though, that if I were a committee member right now, I would want to know what are the underlying foundations of our expenses. And so I want to give you a couple quick understandings that I have arrived at this year. With respect to our teacher and classified and administrator pay, we're like a lot of other districts, we get a certain pile of money. And when we did our contracting, we agreed that we wanted to hit a certain level. It is not Cadillac level compensation standard. So, and Olivia and Ryan, you can help me in terms of where our dollars are, but understand that if we go forward with this level of staffing and budgets, it's with a fair statement that says we're just trying to get our staff to a little bit above a median of comparable districts because we want to attract good people. So that was an assumption. So when you play with that, the other things that we did is in our budget, we committed to safe, healthy kids in schools. And that's not Cadillac. That's minimum in today's world of darned smartphones that let kids get depressed and other things that kids that are having behavioral problems. The stuff that we added this year is not Cadillac. It's get to a solid, good classroom atmosphere support staff, behavior training. So if I were you, I'd want to know, well, did you guys have any extra Cadillac? There's not a giant music program here or a giant art program or a giant library that we can go and say, oh, well, those are areas that traditionally we should. No, it's pretty Chevrolet Ford basic stuff that we've adopted in our present level and are asking to continue. So my bottom line there would be, we kind of have a choice. And I think the right thing is, but I can make an argument the other way. The right thing is to go forward with, this is a really good, solid budget from a really good school district that is showing good gains, but it's not with any fat. And then I've watched other government bodies play this game, and what they would do, in contrast to Olivia and Ryan's wisdom, they'd say, we're going to cut 12 teachers and we're going to cut music programs, and then we would go and say, now, if you guys like that, fine, but otherwise go up and yell at the legislature, because that's what we're doing. And I don't want to play that game. I just know that we did a pretty good job, in my mind, this year and over last year, coming up with a budget, and we should move forward saying, this is a good budget. My last comment is there is a process whereby we, the board, have set up and fund a rainy day fund. And if this isn't a rainy day, I don't know what is. So obviously the budget needs to, if cuts come, the budget needs to look at that as a source. And I just wanted the budget committee to understand that that's sitting out there, but it doesn't solve the problem on a big cut. It just is something that we're ready to call this a rainy day. At least I am, and we can make that work. I guess the last part, last is that commitment to listen that Teresa's raised rightly and so on. I don't think this is the right time, although if people want to give us their thoughts on where they would make cuts or where they would add, if they think we don't have enough money in some places, but that we would be committed to listen to people down the road. I just want to make sure that's voiced. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Lou.
Thanks. So I'm still really new at this budget process, right? So if this has already been gone over and I just didn't hear it correctly, has there been an official ask to make cuts at this point? Okay, so those are just like anticipated, like we may have to cut, but there's not been a directive that we actually need to cut funds. Okay. Because I think it's easy to get stuck in that mode of like forecasting without knowing the actual amount, even though we know that there's going to be a deficit. We don't know if there's going to be any relief funds at all. I mean, I'm not super optimistic about that, but you never know. And so I was a little bit concerned that we're going to get too stuck on thinking about potential cuts instead of waiting, or if there's hasn't even been asked to do a practice run yet. I think it's wise to just do those behind the scenes and say, like, if there are cuts, this is our practice run of what that may look like. And is there a reason why we can't wait until a little bit later? Because earlier in the meeting, it said that it had to be approved by the end of June. Was that correct? Okay, I'm just trying to keep track of it all. This is a lot of information, and it's like such an intense year to be jumping right in with y'all. Is there a reason we can't wait until a little bit later into June in case there is more direction given on if there needs to be cuts made? And or is there something that says we need to do it in May? Is it just our processes? And if so, is that something that we can do a suggested amendment to for this year?
Okay, I'll start a response to that. I don't think it's necessarily out of the question if the budget committee wanted to meet again in June, but also take into account the board meeting, or the school board would also need to meet at some point in time after the budget committee, because the budget committee approves the budget and then the school board adopts the budget. The last school board meeting as of now that's on the calendar is June 11th, I believe. And so like I said, it's not out of the question to think that we couldn't have a budget meeting later in the year and then have another board meeting later in the year. But I don't think we'll have any information that's specific enough to change kind of the what we're talking about right now. Like I said, the May forecast is probably just going to confirm all of our suspicions that state revenues are going to be projected lower than what was anticipated. But that won't necessarily trigger any action or call to reduction at that point. And so I think it's kind of, I mean, it could be a decision that the committee makes as a group or with input from the superintendent. But it's not like we couldn't do that. But I don't know that it would, the timing would make a difference compared to sort of where we're at right now.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Just knowing like if we're not going to get any guidance before then, like it wouldn't make any sense anyways. But okay, yeah, because I know like it is stressful thinking about like who knows because we don't know for sure. This is like budget 2 that I'm have to think about in my life, but that relies on state stuff and the coronavirus impacts. And have we thought about asking the public for potential solutions instead of just thinking about what to cut? Like is there any creative solutions they can think of to help supplement the budget? Like some people may know some really great programs or other sources of revenue that could be sought throughout the year. That may be extra work, but it's just thinking about like involving the public a little more because like Therese brought up, I'm glad that was already brought up, like it's really important to have public comment. And I know like there's some public involved in the process by having the board, but we're limited to that scope. And I'm not saying you all aren't doing a really great job in thinking about a lot of different things. There just may be some other ideas on like how to supplement the budget or creative solutions if there are cuts. And so maybe that could be an idea of like, hey, is there anybody that knows, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of outside the box here. I like to think outside the box, in other words, and I'm trying to think of ways to involve the public that's not in a deficit model, because I think like we have a lot of great community members that care a lot about the kids in the community. And that doesn't have to necessarily be answered right this second. It's just a question I want to throw out there. But those are my main 3 questions was like, because I feel like if there's not been an ask to do a reduction yet, then should we be doing that at this point? Or do we wait? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. We haven't had any requests to do a reduction up to this point. I agree with Olivia that I think that the information that we get will be after the deadline for adopting a budget. Anything that's really specific and really gives us the guidance we need. And I think at that point, there will need to be ongoing community conversation about some of those pieces. And if people have ideas and suggestions to bring forward, I think that there are things that we're open to hearing. We know that there's, one of the things we anticipate is some money from the federal government in relief related to COVID, and we'll wait to see if other things come through that channel as well. So there are definitely avenues that we're looking at and paying attention to. And I think that we'll continue to do that. But there's also, if there is additional ideas and suggestions, we're definitely not a closed off group.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, because some of the stuff that we've been talking about how like there's all these great things and that happen in the district. I'm sure other districts feel the same way. And I'm sure a lot of other budgets look similar where it's over time, because this isn't like, it's not like there's been a huge increase in budgets across the board for state funding in general, right? It's not like budgets have been going up substantially, but cost of living does, and so do increases in pay and benefits and everything. So those are things I'm thinking about, like that it's already a lean budget, has been mentioned. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room other than like some essential stuff like staffing and everything. So that's where I'm just like, there's not a lot to cut, in other words. And I see that happen way too much with state budgets, and in the state budget in general, there's a big chunk of that pie does already go to education in K-12. And so that's another thing, like if we're thinking about like overall in the state, if that much is already being invested, like there's not a whole lot of wiggle room in the state budget too, if you're looking at the whole picture of the whole pie. So I think that, I'm just saying, I think that creative solutions are going to be really necessary.
Mhm. Yeah, just two things. Sorry, I just talked over you. I didn't mean to. The two things I would add, one is that I know that we're a fortunate school district and that we have a local option levy, which brings us additional revenue that some neighboring districts don't have access to. So the community has stepped up to support our work, which we're really appreciative of. The second point I was going to make, I lost it. I know I'll come back to it here in just a second. But again, I do think we're a community that really supports public education, and we're fortunate in that regard. And it does allow us to have some programs. Jay rattled them off, but there's other districts that don't have art and music and physical education across their elementary schools. There's a number of districts in that situation. So I know that there's things that we've been able to do and add that doesn't really feel like an ad. It feels like an essential in a well-rounded education. But there are things that we're able to access and our kids are able to utilize here.
Well, thanks. That's all my questions for right now.
Thank you. Vince, you're up.
Thank you. I've seen lots of things in Zoom, but I've never seen a cattail go down in front of the camera there. Well done, Peter. I've really appreciated this conversation, and I really appreciate how the committee is really struggling to make sense of this really unsettling time. A lot of our concern really has centered around the state school fund and deficiencies in the state school fund, but the budget committee process, an important part of that is setting the tax rates. Not only does the school board have to approve the budget by June 30th by statute, but we also have to set the levy rates, and that's embedded in this process, and that needs to be done by July 15th. And this is all going to be before you've heard from both Ryan and Olivia that we're really not going to have certainty about our fiscal outlook until about that time, or maybe even a little later. So we are between a rock and a hard place. We're in a situation where we don't have certainty. Nevertheless, there are things that we have to get done. In the supplemental budget process cannot set levy rates, so we can't delay our process until later. So we're up against the law. I really like the idea of reconvening the budget committee, and I would support that provisionally on the stipulation that I'm not sure that we can legally do that. I think that's something that we need to explore. But I really like the idea of bringing our citizen committee members back. The people that are on this, the citizen members on this committee, you're here for a reason. You're selected on purpose, because we need extra eyes on our budget and we need your help in navigating this. So I think it's important to have you at the table. That said, I'm not comfortable rushing this process. I think staff needs adequate time. You've already heard that they've essentially been preparing two budgets at the same time. They prepared the one that you're seeing right now, the one that we would have liked to have had. We know that that's not really going to be possible. And in the background, they're working fervently to prepare for what is going to be a fiscal disaster. And we just don't know what that looks like. And I just want to make sure that they have adequate time to give us the clearest picture possible. So I really would prefer to let them have the time. I'd love to, if we don't see a supplemental budget until later in the summer or even the fall, I would be comfortable with that, because I definitely want some deep thought to go into that process. So it's what's best for our students and for our staff. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to Bill.
Yeah, I just had a question for Olivia. Olivia, in your discussion with Peter, you mentioned the school day cost of one school day. And I glossed over that a little bit. Can you just repeat that number?
Sure. If we were to furlough all of our staff that are funded by the general fund, that would save approximately $230,000 per day.
Okay, so in relationship to the 5 to 9 million that you mentioned, the upper levels, 40 school days roughly, and that's just for staff.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Josh.
And I just want to add, that's not what we would do.
Very good. Josh.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I just want to reiterate, I really do appreciate our public servants here, all you guys that are on this call right now. It is difficult, so I really appreciate you guys' hard work on this. I did have one question. It wasn't clear to me on the capital projects funds. I'm super excited about all the capital projects we've got going on. I was wondering, from the budget, it's not clear. Are we kind of sticking within the budget right now with what was projected from last year? I was wondering if you guys could speak to that as far as what's in the proposed budget here, if that's sort of in line with what was, forecast from the year before, if that's been changing over time, or kind of how it's going with the capital projects right now.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of our projects and project budgets, we are very much in alignment with where we thought we would be. All of the projects that we had anticipated to be going on right now are happening, with the exception of the project at Crescent Valley High School. We just recently made a decision to postpone that work for 12 months. And so that project was supposed to start this spring. And so we're looking at a new start date for that project of next spring. But we have work underway at Garfield, at Lincoln, and at Sheldonland Middle School right now. And we're also doing some like smaller projects, a roofing replacement at Corvallis High School, and some other of those like smaller projects that have been happening right now. And I would say that with the school closure, we started some projects earlier than what we had anticipated. And so in terms of the bond, I think everything's actually gone really smoothly. And we haven't had any situations where the budget was exceeded or where we tapped into any bond reserves in excess of what was planned or anticipated. Part of the reason why the Crescent Valley project was delayed, it was due to the budget coming in higher than what we had anticipated. So part of the delays is going to be around kind of reworking the scope and doing some other things. But our biggest project right now is the Lincoln Elementary School replacement. And we have we have agreed to a guaranteed maximum price within the budget. And so it's all actually been really positive news coming out of that. And especially with everything that's going on right now, having adapted pretty well to making changes to plans and how work is done. So I think Ryan has some more to add to that.
Actually, I think Olivia covered most of everything I was going to say. The only thing I would add to the comment about Crescent Valley is that the bids were scheduled to come in right when everything started to close down. So the timing of that was unfortunate. But other than that, we have projects going. We're paying close attention to supply chain. We're paying close attention to social distancing requirements as projects are going on. Things that people wouldn't think of, everything from disinfecting the ladders as people are going up and down them, as we've been doing the roofing at Corvallis High School, all those factors. So even though this has been going on and the social distancing measures, we've been able to still make progress.
And I would just add one thing in terms of the budget document and what's presented. It's probably likely that we'll end up spending less than what's presented in this proposed budget, primarily due to the delay of that CV project, because that wasn't necessarily anticipated when we developed the budget.
Thank you.
I had a question related to student enrollment and then staffing. So it looked like last year we had an increase of 84 when we're trying to project enrollment. I think we projected 160. What do we normally use to make those projections? Do we use like the survey that comes to me in email saying, will you re-enroll, or what formula do we use? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. For grades 1 through 12, we use the cohort survival ratio. And so what we do is we look at the change between one grade level to the next over the period of multiple years. And so we look at, how many kids were in first grade last year and how many were counted in second grade this year. And we look at that actually at the school level. So it's a pretty detailed level. And we sometimes use a 2-year cohort survival ratio, or a 3-year or 4-year, 5-year, just kind of based on what we're experiencing. And so for kids who are currently in school, we look at current year enrollment, and we look at previous enrollment in those previous year grades. For kindergarten, we look at birth rates. So we'll look at the birth rate at the state of Oregon 6 years ago. We look at the birth rates for our 2 biggest zip codes. And then we kind of have a formula where we look at that over a period of time to see how many kinders did we have in a certain year, and what was the birth rate 6 years ago. And we sort of develop what we call like a trend. And I would say, obviously kindergarten is the hardest one for us to predict, because we can't assume that like every student that enrolls in kindergarten was born in Corvallis. And so that can get a little tricky. And I would also say that the birth rates in Oregon as a state and even locally haven't really increased much, but we still see a higher number of kids. So there are students obviously that move into the state after they're born, and we know that's pretty common. And so, there's a variety of methods to use. Sometimes we look at increase in housing, but to be honest with you, in our area, there is very little to no correlation when we see an increase in the number of units. We kind of know what other districts use when they gauge, like, how many students would you get when you have an apartment complex that has 50 units. Our numbers don't really pan out that way. And when you think about our enrollment and how it's increased by 33 kids in the last 5 years, clearly the correlation to added housing isn't there, because we know that there's been an increase in housing. And so what that tells us is that when we have new housing, it's often not being occupied by school-age children.
And I guess that kind of leads me to my second question, which is on 18, if anybody has their budget with them. I've heard, right, in various conversations about how carefully we have to look at when we add staffing and those ratios. And I'm not at all saying that we have the staff, we're at staffing levels that would be ideal for our kids. I think that we do the very best we can. But last year it looked like with our 84 students, so we ended up, or we budgeted to add 29 FTE staff. And but then a couple of weeks, maybe it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, Olivia, I saw your presentation about how kind of we have this flat enrollment, but we've continued to add staff. We need to take a good hard look at that. And then this year, in this proposed budget, we look at adding an additional 32 FTE. I'm wondering kind of what the assumption was there, or maybe there's something that I'm not understanding in terms of where the staff is going in relation to our enrollment.
Yeah, and so I just want to be really clear when we look at the comparison between budgeted FTE and proposed FTE for next year, what I would say is that our actual FTE right now is higher than our budgeted FTE. So when we roll all of our current staffing into next year, from a budget perspective, it does look like an increase, but it's actually almost a flat change. So when you think about how our spending looks from one year to the next, we don't anticipate a big increase in salaries and benefits because we're experiencing that right now. So oftentimes what happens, and I'm just going to use, this is probably the most common example, our teaching and learning department creates a budget proposal that becomes part of the proposed budget. The budget's adopted. But let's say the teaching and learning department has, you know, like a $5 million budget. They may be adding like an educational assistant in a special education environment, let's say in the middle of the year because a new student moved in. And so that happens pretty frequently where staff is added after the budget is adopted. But kind of how we operate is that each department needs to stay within their adopted budget. So they might be spending their funds a little bit differently, but they're still sort of limited to that overall budget amount. And it's most common in the areas of special education. We have a lot of changes that happen frequently from year to year and even throughout the year. And so we're often responding to student needs that arise that are usually unanticipated. And so the most of the change in staffing that you see from the budget perspective is just to kind of reconcile ourselves to what it's currently looking like. And we do know we have that inverse relationship of enrollment growth and staffing growth. And so that is obviously, Ryan had kind of talked about, you know, some of the examinations we're doing. And that's part of the work too, is that we're looking at areas where we spend more per student than maybe some of our peer districts. And so those are the areas that we're going to look at, and probably the areas we're going to look at most with regard to staffing, because it does make up the majority of our budget.
Thank you. Over to Lou.
Yeah, it's somewhat tangentially related, I guess. I was looking at the numbers that the salary for substitutes went way down in the proposed budget. And I was just wondering if that demand has gone down and if there was any thought put into the, if there's teachers that will be out due to either COVID illness next year or that aren't able to work full-time, like their full hours due to caring for other people in their homes or anything like that. Was that in consideration when dropping that? Because I can't remember the amount, but it was pretty substantial that went down.
Yeah, and that's actually due to a change in how we are staffing substitutes. So last year was the first year that we began working with a staffing agency. And so the majority of our substitutes are contracted. And so that expense is classified differently than it used to be. So it used to be classified as a salary because they were a district employee. And now it's classified as a purchased service because they are contracted through a company. We made that change primarily to build a more robust substitute pool because we were struggling with having enough coverage of substitutes on certain days. And so it was a strategy to increase our substitute pool, and it has been proven to be pretty effective. I know in the last year and a half, we've had better rates of filled absences. And so it's not necessarily a change in the level of it's not a change in necessarily what's happening. It just has to be classified differently because rather than being a district employee, it's a contracted service.
Okay, cool. That makes a ton of sense because the area went up too. So,
Right.
cool, thank you. Appreciate
So
that.
if you're looking, so the object that it's classified under is other purchase services. It's the 390. And so you'll probably see how that increased starting last year around the same time that the salary object for substitutes started to go down.
Thanks. I didn't have the context, so that's super
Yeah,
helpful.
no, it's okay.
Jay,
So just 3 clarifying questions or comments. We have an obligation to all those staff people that are working in our district. Ryan or Olivia, would you remind me what happens in June if there are cuts? Their contract says they can, I mean, we haven't entered into any new contract with them as in individually. They would just get a notice that says, sorry, due to budget cuts, we can't employ you. Is that a fair statement of what happens? And the only other thing, I mean, spinning that backwards, if we came up with a budget now and I'm a teacher that just got recently hired, I might start worrying, but I think I might start worrying if I read the newspaper. So I guess I'm trying to be fair to them. My second comment would be with respect to Vince, I don't think we would have to worry about the budget committee law if it's okay within our own bylaws to form a board committee that is made up of some citizens. I mean, so you don't call it a budget committee, but you might call it an advisory committee made up of, so that would be a thought. And last one, Vince, you raised the question about levy rates. So what happens if we adopt a budget and there's a rate, but then we have to adopt a new budget? How does the county get our new rate? I'm just a technical question, I guess. I don't know. You know how that works? Or do they get a new rate? Do we get to keep telling them it's a high rate? Thank you very much. Send us the money.
I can answer that. When the school board adopts and certifies the tax levy and the tax rates, that information is then passed on to to Benton and Lynn County, because we are in both of those counties. And that information is required to be provided to the counties by July 15th. And that then becomes incorporated into your property tax assessment that happens in the fall. So we cannot change the rates once they are certified for a certain fiscal year.
Okay.
And then to your other 2 questions, one was around layoffs, and there's processes that are outlined in the contracts with our licensed and classified staff regarding that. And then in terms of a committee, this is, the caution I always give this group around a board committee versus a superintendent committee. There's different rules around notice and around minutes and all those pieces. So typically we have gone with superintendent committees because it allows it's less staff intensive and cost intensive to go that route. So again, I don't think we're deciding that tonight, but it's always it's kind of my reminder to the group.
Margaret.
So I was just wondering, from an equity standpoint, I was looking at the spending per student at the various schools, and it seems like it's a little hard to analyze. I'm wondering how difficult would it be to separate out non-educational type spending, like if one building is old and so it takes a lot to heat or cool it or whatever. Would that be asking like too much staff time to sort of figure out, well, what part of that number is actually relating to student learning as opposed to just non-essential things like how the building is heated?
I think we'd have to have really clear and definitive parameters around what we were including and or excluding in those calculations. And it would probably take quite a bit of time because it would probably require a lot of manual manipulation of how we classify some spending.
Okay.
So it's hard to say. I don't know for sure. what that would look like.
Okay, well, I won't ask for that, but it just does seem like something, for future years, that if the board were sort of to investigate, I would find that interesting. And then one last point, you're still allowing us to email questions in between board meetings. So I do have some other sort of more detailed kind of questions that would be better asked by email, I think.
Okay,
And I'll try not to take too much staff time on that, but I do, nonetheless have some questions.
We did get a handful of questions a couple of days ago from a budget committee member. And so, we've started to draft those responses. And so we can add your questions if they come in before, the next meeting.
Okay.
And going back to what you were talking about before, like using the example of a building and like, a building heat and, what that looks like, those expenses, we don't assign those costs to when we're looking at the spending per student that's reported in the ESSA school level reporting pages. Like utilities, like building utilities aren't, I don't think that they're included in those costs. And maybe what would be helpful is for me to provide information about what is included, and you can kind of let me know if like these are the things that you would want to see excluded and then recalculated.
Mm-hmm. So are you suggesting that those numbers already pretty much reflect what's going on with student learning?
Yeah, it should only. Yeah, and I can provide more detail on what expenses are included. And so if it's not on that list, then it just means it's not included. And it's primarily staffing. And so for any given school, it would obviously be the school staffing. And then when we have department staff like special education or English language learner staff that are funded through a department, but they're assigned to a school, we include those as well. So I'll make that one of your questions, and then I'll respond to that.
Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
The equity comment just reminded me of one thing too that I noticed in the information pack. I know that it's the regulatory race reporting has certain requirements about it, but it kind of creates a misrepresentation of students in the schools when the multiracial students are lumped together in the way they are. And I know this is a huge problem at like OSU too, that I bring up and other folk bring up it. And I brought it up at the school board before too at this with this, but it changes how schools are viewed and what additional funds may be able to be sought after if there's funding for certain demographics. And so, for example, then if you look at the trends on the racial demographics, certain populations are going down while the multiracial group is going up, right? So it's going to look like there's less students that may be able to, we may be able to write like a grant to provide programming or support staff for, if that makes sense. And I know like I bring up the Indian education program quite often as a additional way to get staff to support Native students in the community, but the way the data is showing a downtrend doesn't help that case. And I don't know if this is like a bigger picture problem question, but I think because we're talking about budgets and what's possible, that not having a clear picture of who's included in that group could impact additional funding we could be seeking.
And that's one of the pieces that I've had a chance to talk just briefly about in the past is the work that Amy and Nikki, who are our elementary and secondary coordinators, along with Lori, who helps a lot with data, have been talking about. So it's something that we recognize and something we're continuing to have discussion about. So we hear you on that one.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear there's work being done on it.
Okay, we're at 8:45, and so I'm going to move us on. If people have a chance to further explore the budget and have questions, please email them to Olivia. I'm going to move on to adopt the minutes. So I need to invite a motion for the adoption of the May 16th, 2019 minutes.
I move that we adopt the May 16th, 2000, I'm going to forget what the 19 minutes.
A second?
I second it.
Thank you, Jay. So now we need to hold a vote on the motion. So all those in favor of adopting the May 16th, 2019 minutes. Say
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
although opposed? All right.
I need to abstain because I was not present.
Thank you. Any
Yeah,
other
I'm
abstaining?
I'm abstaining as well since this is my first meeting. I don't really feel comfortable voting yay or nay on something I wasn't present for.
Thank you for that. I forgot that option. Okay, I'm now reminding everybody of the next meeting, which our next meeting will be Thursday, May 28th, 2020 at 6:30 p.m. Public testimony will be taken. I need to solicit a motion to adjourn.
Can I ask a question, Leanna, if that's
Yep.
okay?
Sorry, I forgot. I didn't see your hand.
That's okay. So I want to check in with Olivia and staff if there is a deadline by which they strongly advise us to send emails with our questions before that time, so they can guarantee to get a response to us by the next meeting. Is there a specific date that they want to set for us?
Hold on just 1 second here.
Okay.
So the Monday of that week is the Memorial Day holiday. So ideally, if any questions could be submitted by the end of the day on that day. And then when I start my week on Tuesday, that gives me a couple of days to get everything together.
Thank you, Olivia.
And is that information going to be put on the district homepage too?
The Q&A will be distributed to the committee via email, and then we usually include it with the meeting materials and minutes.
I meant like the deadline for the public to know. That way they know where to look for it.
Oh, the Q&A is just for committee members. For public testimony, it would be noon on the day of the meeting.
Okay, and is that on the homepage?
Yes.
Okay, cool, thanks.
And so we're all sending our questions by the end of the day on May 25th. If we want to answer, we actually want to answer. Okay, now I need a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn our meeting.
A second. Anyone?
I said,
Thank you, Sarah. All right. Do we need to vote? It doesn't.
I think it's by proclamation. So if I'm not mistaken, you can roll it by the gavel on the hand and we're good.
We're adjourned. See everybody on the 28th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye. Good night.